Imagine you're living in the 1950s. The war just ended, and life could not be any better. You start a successful business, you own a large piece of land, and you have a well-paying job, a loving family, and best of all, you live in the best country in the world, America, the epicenter of innovation and freedom for a specific group of people. Freedom of expression, art, and relative economic equality. Life is good, but just when you thought things could not get any better, the parasites crawl into your life. They demand fair pay, insurance, and a safe working environment. They demand that you treat them like a decent human being. However, you want to mistreat your employees just enough that it does not count as slavery. If only there was a society where a man could do as they please without the threat of regulation and human morality. A society like this would truly be a man's paradise.
Bioshock is a 2007 shooter developed by Irrational Games, primarily at the time known as the developers of System Shock 2. Bioshock attempted to change the public perception of first-person shooters among general audiences by innovating and introducing many features that were heavily influential to games today. Let's take some time out of your day to discuss the early development of Bioshock and how the developers crafted such a unique experience. Would you kindly grab a seat, some seafood, and Kool-Aid, and let's begin.
Oh God, you sick fuck, let me out of there!
The beginnings and blueprints for Bioshock actually began before the release of a title named System Shock, developed by Looking Glass Studio. System Shock was an action-adventure FPS set within a spaceship controlled by a rogue AI. The game heavily emphasized player exploration, environmental storytelling, puzzles, and old-school shooting and combat mechanics that required the player to be systematic and careful in encounters to progress the plot. System Shock was received well by players when it released in 1994. However, the game wasn't exactly what you'd call player-friendly in terms of giving you direction on mechanics and the level layouts. It was a pretty niche title, which led to games like Doom inevitably overshadowing it in the market, and this niche nature also led to poor performance in terms of sales. Several years later, Ken Levine, who helped work on the studio's new game Thief: The Dark Project, started his own gaming studio with Jonathan Che and Robert Furmeyer by the name of Irrational Games. In collaboration with Looking Glass Studio, Irrational would begin work on Junction Point, a codename for System Shock 2, which many members of the developing team thought still had a lot of potential.
Pathetic creature of meat and bone, panting and sweating as you run through my corridors.
System Shock 2 is a natural progression of the first game, building upon many features from the first, such as larger environments that were easier to navigate, vastly greater graphics, a better approach to combat and shooting gameplay, and a fantastic presentation of the story through environmental storytelling. Much like the first game, System Shock 2 was met with critical acclaim, but failed to garner interest from a wider audience. Perhaps it was releasing in a competitive year, or maybe the game was just too niche. Whatever the reason, the game failed to make any significant monetary gain, immensely damaging the morale of the developers and leading to the shutdown of Looking Glass Studio. A year after the commercial failure of System Shock 2, Ken Levine would create a pitch for a System Shock continuation that would address the cliffhanger at the end of the second game.
What's the matter, lover? Don't you like my new look?
It It's important to know that despite System Shock 2's commercial failure, many irrational game developers still saw immense potential in the game's ideas and formula and hoped to continue the series in some form. Well, except for Ken Levine himself, who openly admitted that he wasn't very excited on continuing to develop the series. Electronic Arts, who Ken had pitched the third game to, also seemed to share that belief, as they would reject the idea.
I wasn't particularly excited about doing this because it was very disappointing when we did System Shock 2 and nobody bought it. It got great reviews, it got these insane reviews, but it left us in a place where it didn't really move the needle for us in terms of making payroll. So I wasn't super excited about it because I didn't see a publisher be interested in it, and I didn't see the audience actually be particularly interested in this kind of game. And it was really the team who convinced me to invest in this because their enthusiasm. I think a lot of them came to the studio because of System Shock 2. And so finally they sort of battered me down. And it's good they did because I was not the first fan of doing this.
It's true that System Shock was a game series with immense potential, but without much interest from the general gaming public. The chances of seeing the series continue was a distant dream, unless they found a way to make it appealing to a broader demographic. So it was decided that instead of trying to continue the System Shock series, it was much better to create an original IP that served as a spiritual successor to the System Shock franchise. Members of the Irrational team continued to work on this potential new title, itching to return to the gameplay formula of System Shock, much to the apprehension of Ken Levine, who was only continuing to develop the series. Due to the encouragement of many of the developers, they would work on this project on the side while simultaneously pitching and developing other projects such as SWAT 4, Freedom Force, Monster Island, Deep Cover, The Lost, and a unique monster shooter by the name of Division 9, which Ken Levine believes would have been a major title if it had ever released.
So we came with this thing called Division 9.
Division 9, yeah.
That probably would have been even a bigger financial success than Bioshock. Wow. But we couldn't get anybody interested in it.
You didn't have enough werewolves in the demo, I think.
We had 0 werewolves in the demo. Yeah, we were going to have werewolves, weren't we?
Werewolves and vampires. So
really?
Yeah,
Werewolves and
vampires.
Irrational was an independent studio without funding from a major publisher, so any funding they gained from their collaborations and projects were used to help develop this new game on the side. In 2002, they would create several prototypes, including a demo for the original Xbox. This demo and prototypes would be presented to several publishers by Ken Levine, but very few of them seemed interested in the project. Desperate to get funding for the game, and the developers beginning to give up hope on the project getting greenlit, Ken Levine would contact a writer from GameSpot to check out the game and write an article about what they were working on. This article paid off immensely, as its buzz attracted the attention of major publishers like 2K Games, who offered to fund the title, interested in the vision Irrational had for the project. With newfound funding reaching $15 million and a plethora of new developers added onto the project, Bioshock would enter full development, and the initial vision for the project would undergo substantial changes. We would not see just how much the project had evolved until E3 2006, when the official cinematic trailer released to the public, showing the player the overall style, premise, and characters of the game. This cinematic trailer would be followed by a gameplay showcase, further diving into many of the game's mechanics. The showcase and trailer were well received by gamers, loving the look of the visuals and mechanics. This positive reception was likely a large boost of morale for the developers of the game, and they'd continue to refine and improve the experience for the next several months. Their hard work paid off immensely, as Bioshock released to critical acclaim and remains one of the greatest first-person shooters of the 2000s. However, what exactly led to this monumental success? let's take the time to look at every element within the game to see how they were developed and optimized for the final product.
They told me, son, you're special. You were born to do great things.
The game begins with a man on a plane in the 1960s. The man speaks about his parents for a brief moment. Before getting up, the screen cuts to black and the plane presumably crashes into the Atlantic Ocean. Voiced by art director Nate Wells, this character is named Jack, and he's the playable protagonist for the game. He's mostly a silent character during your entire playthrough, and he only ever speaks in this opening cutscene. The reason for this creative decision is that the developers did not want to force an identity onto the player, and the goal was to make Jack a sort of blank slate that would change based on the player's actions, like whether he was morally just or a selfish monster, a design philosophy they may have borrowed from the System Shock games. After the crash, we slowly emerge from the water, seeing the result of our actions. We see a lighthouse in the distance, with no workers, which we don't question. We're just happy we have something to escape to from this freezing cold. The light at the top serving as a beacon of our salvation, or maybe even an ominous call in some early art. Anyways, we're greeted by more somber music, so we can ignore the hundreds of people that just died. It's one of the few moments of peace in the game before the chaos we'll inevitably encounter. One interesting fact is that there was meant to be a shootout at this location, where Jack would have to force his way into the lighthouse by combating who I assume to be guards protecting the gates to the city. However, considering the impact of our first encounter with enemies from the game, an action set piece at this location would be out of place and change the overall structure of the first few levels. We enter the lighthouse, where we are immediately greeted by mid-1900s Art Deco architecture and a giant statue of the lead antagonist of the game. The words at the bottom imply that this is a society where men are free without the influence of a higher authority. However, this is contradicted by the statue itself, which portrays the man as some kind of supreme leader. People don't often construct golden statues of themselves if they don't view themselves as above others. Anyways, in this lighthouse, we make our way towards a sort of submarine-like machine called a bathysphere, an underwater transport system we'll encounter a lot during our journey. Originally, the bathysphere was meant to be a sort of train system that would later be cut. Anyways, once we enter the bathysphere, we're taken into the wondrous underwater metropolis of Rapture, one of the most unique and mesmerizing cities ever created, a modern-day Atlantis which easily surpasses every wonder of the world. This surreal and fantastical city, hidden under the Atlantic, was built by a man named Andrew Ryan, an individualist business tycoon who constructed the city in the 1950s as a utopia for the rich and wealthy of the world. He hated the idea of government control, social programs, and providence, and sought to create a society where one could freely develop their business and practice their talent without the fear of morality and regulation.
On the surface, I once bought a forest. The parasites claimed that the land belonged to God and demanded that I establish a public park there. Why? So the rabble could stand slack-jawed under the canopy and pretend that it was paradise earned. Congress moved to nationalize my forest. I burnt it to the ground. God did not plant the seeds of this Arcadia. I did.
Rapture flourished for a while due to its extreme, unchained capitalism, but of course, in a society that values objectivism over all else, there would eventually be a class divide, a boiling desperation between the rich and poor, until an uprising emerged from this tension, destroying Rapture's society before it had a chance to really establish itself. Andrew Ryan and his philosophy was inspired by many individuals, including Russian-American author and philosopher Ayn Rand, who promoted radical self-interest and individualism, Howard Hughes, and John Davison Rockefeller. Besides Ayn Rand, who influenced the narrative and themes of the game, Rockefeller was instrumental in the creation of Rapture as a location for the developers. At first, when they were brainstorming the location for the game, Ken Levine and the developers wanted to set the game in an isolated setting. They essentially wanted to curate the types of experience the player would be given by giving them the freedom to do whatever they wanted, but also not give them unrealistic expectations about the extent they could explore the world. By setting the game somewhere isolated, they could organically control what the player experienced without putting resources into building a world, as Irrational did not have the money to possibly create something that grand.
I think our philosophy was always to do what we were doing 100% rather than try to do something bigger and do it 50% or 40%. So one of the ideas of, and this sort of came from System Shock 2 as well, where you focus on an area that you can really bring to life and you kind of eliminate the questions of, well, why can't I go over the bridge to New Jersey? So we were able to really make a place, I think, that felt believable and real, even though in actuality it was really quite limited. But we just sort of dressed it with all these buildings outside that were all, were all basically glorified fakes. We let the story drive what we needed to show rather than some kind of like predetermined map which we set down, which is a little different than like System Shock 2, where we actually mapped a spaceship out deck by deck.
Yeah. Many different time periods were thought up, like the 1930s and the future. Interestingly, the first exploration of a setting was an underwater base that was abandoned and decaying from years of neglect. The problem was that the base did not really look like it was underwater. In fact, the aesthetic appeared like some kind of dark space station with only a few barnacles and dripping water to indicate where the player was. Presumably, this idea for the location would eventually evolve into the first major version of Bioshock. This early iteration surrounded a cult deprogrammer named Carlos Coelho, who after being hired by a senator, infiltrates an elusive cult named the Serene Dawn, located on an isolated tropical island. Your mission is to save the daughter of this senator, who's been taken in by this strange cult. When your helicopter is shot down near this island, you would uncover a secret underwater base. This underwater base appears like a strange sci-fi facility with large looming machinery, metallic walls that enclose you into this space, blinding blue lights which serve as their only illumination, and giant wires crawling and wrapping around parts of the facility, leading into giant pools of water. It gives off the strange feeling of sentience, as if the facility itself is a living organism, a hybrid of biology and technology to create a horrific location. The horror of this location was on purpose, as the creative goal for Bioshock, at least early on, was to invoke visceral fear from the player. It was potentially around this time, or a bit before, that the original 2002 demo was created, and according to the developers, few of the team were keen on the design of the map, as it appeared too much like a dark space station or an underground sewer of New York City. However, I want to make one thing clear. I'm not actually sure when the demo was made. It could have actually been made after this or way before. It's really hard to pinpoint which version of the game the demo originated from. If you know more info about it, let me know in the comments. This game is relatively fleshed out in terms of mechanics, gameplay, and even the general story, but the game really only existed so Irrational would have a general premise to pitch to publishers. but very few of them seemed very interested in this version of the game. Later, it would evolve once again, now set in the near future, focusing on scientists uncovering a Nazi-built underwater genetics lab filled with strange, grotesque creatures. At some point after World War II, the lab was abandoned by whoever built it, and now a new group inhabits it. We have very few glimpses of what this location looked like, but the few looks we do have paint the picture of a dark and eerie location lit up by test tubes proliferating the laboratory. We know another minor demo was made using this location, but we don't have many glimpses of this early game, which showcases how it looked like visually. However, to be clear, I'm not entirely 100% sure this map originated from this version of the game. After this iteration of the map, they finally came up with the idea to set it within an underwater city, which would be developed further for the foreseeable future. Essentially, those three versions of the Bioshock game, the original pitch version involving a cult on a tropical island, the version set within a Nazi laboratory which gained attention from the press and publishers due to its intriguing demo, and the final version which actually shares a lot of overlap with the second version as they share many core mechanics. This version also went through some additional iterations until it became the game we have today. I know it was not this simple, and there were likely countless other iterations of this game during development, but for simplicity's sake, let's break them down to these three major versions. All these variations of the game have vastly different aesthetics, gameplay, and stories, and each build upon each other to help create the final version of the experience. Keep this list in mind, as we'll be returning to it a lot during the course of this video. The final aesthetic of Bioshock was not decided until Ken Levine visited the Rockefeller Center in New York City. He loved the Art Deco aesthetic of the building, the architecture, including the giant statue at the front, and the story of how John D. Rockefeller built the architectural marvel despite economic instability from the Great Depression. Taking inspiration from that story, Levine and other developers came up with the overall visual approach to Rapture, an underwater civilization that was the epitome of greed and self-interest. They also borrowed from stories like George Orwell's 1984 and the film Logan's Run, which focus on utopias that collapse due to greed and human nature. Illustrations by Hugh Ferris also helped to establish the visual aesthetic of the city. They continue to develop the idea of an Art Deco underwater city from this point on, and every piece of art for the game would give varying interpretations on how the locale would look. After being mesmerized by the wondrous awe of Rapture's cityscape, illuminated by the blue glow of the ocean, we finally arrive at our first building within Rapture. Here we finally discover how the exterior of the city was an illusion, concealing the true state of the never great city.
No trespass. Just don't hurt me. Just let me go. Just keep my gun.
A man is skewered onto our window, letting out a blood-curdling scream as his guts are ripped out by a grotesque member of this society. At this point, we would have just left, but unfortunately the vehicle we're in breaks down and we are unable to leave. The person we saw reduce a man to a hunk of KFC chicken is called a Splicer, and they are the main enemy types you'll encounter during your visit to Rapture. Splicers used to be citizens of Rapture, and believe it or not, they weren't always psycho murderers, but regular law-abiding citizens just like most of you watching this. It wasn't until the introduction of Plasmids and Adam into everyday life that these individuals became extreme drug addicts, wandering every street corner in a desperate attempt to find their next dose of Adam, even if it means attacking everyone in their sight.
Light up enemies to 1,000 degrees. Warning, fire spread.
Due to their crazy nature, you can often see splicers engage in strange behavior and converse in nonsensical speech, like talking to a gun like it was a baby.
Can't Mommy hold you to her breast and feel your teeth? Oh no.
Or standing behind you for no reason, like a weirdo.
Tiny imagination. Content to sit there with the tanks of Adam, tweaking and optimizing. I need to create. Adam is a canvas of...
Splicers come in many shapes and sizes, and each have differing abilities to try and combat the player. There's the generally regular enemy types, like the thuggish splicer and the lead-head splicer, who either attack you up close or shoot you from afar. Houdini splicers, who can teleport around and shoot fireballs at you from all directions. Spider splicers, who are extremely agile, crawl on walls, and throw projectiles at the player. And the nitro splicers, who either throw bombs or Molotov cocktails at the player, making them generally the most dangerous enemy type. What I loved about the game is how every enemy type was introduced in a unique way. Irrational were clearly masters of presentation and introducing the player to this strange dystopian world. Thanks to the unique abilities of every splicer, the game overall did a pretty good job at keeping combat encounters fresh and interesting. You can go about dealing with them in the same way, but due to their unique abilities, it's much more interesting to exploit their weaknesses, such as throwing their own bombs back at them or shocking them off the walls. When it comes to the design of the splicers, they appear relatively human, but a look closer at their face shows how they've grown to be grotesque and deformed in many ways. Some grew this way through their chaotic rampage, requiring their faces to be crudely put back together, while others became naturally deformed through the overuse of plasmids and the consumption of Adam. These deformed faces are actually based off old mugshots and the deformed faces of World War II veterans who underwent crude plastic surgery to fix their damaged appearance. As stated before, the catalyst for their horrific mutations mainly can be attributed to the substance known as Adam, found within sea slugs near the ocean floor near Rapture. Adam is a genetic substance that, when entered into one's bloodstream through the use of plasmids, altered their genetic makeup, granting the taker strange supernatural abilities.
My daddy's smarter than Einstein, stronger than Hercules, and lights a fire with a snap of his finger. Are you as good as my daddy, mister? Not if you don't visit the Gatherer's Garden, you aren't. Smart daddies get spliced at the garden.
As we briefly continue through the game, we quickly come in contact with one of these so-called plasmids, which grants the user the ability to electrocute enemies, stunning them in place for a brief period. Other plasmids in the game allow you to freeze them in place and shatter them like glass. Some send enemies flying into the air, summon countless bees that relentlessly attack anyone around them, and even catch rockets as they barrel towards you. Adam is indeed powerful and evolves humanity to heights never seen before, but much like many substances found in our world, Adam can be very addictive, requiring a user to be in constant supply to stay sane. Without it, they go mad and frantically search for any they can find, even if it includes killing those who stand in their way. Of course, messing with your genetic code can lead to other major side effects, such as the deformation of the body, which can be observed in many characters within the game. Well, except for the titular protagonist, who stays relatively normal throughout the entire game. This was not always the case, as originally, Irrational Games had the idea that the more the player used plasmids in the game, the more deformed the player character would become, causing the player to question whether they should sacrifice their humanity in order to get an advantage and become stronger. The feature was cut because you can't even see your character to begin with. It's clear that the idea of mutations due to human experimentation was a pretty major thematic element in the original Bioshock, intrinsically tying Splicers and the substance Adam together in the game's core design.
So we're here to talk about plasmids today, and the world of Rapture and the world of Bioshock in this undersea city. They had this incredible genetic technology they developed. And at first they use it to do things that they use for normal medicines they have in the world, just in cooler ways. They did it to heal disease, to make people smarter, to make them faster, to make them stronger. But then they started using them to develop, as the Civil War evolved in Rapture, to do essentially man-body weaponry. The ability to start fires with your mind, the ability to telekinesis objects, the ability to freeze objects with just the force of will. And the player, as they progress through the world of Rapture, as well as the ability to find these incredible weapons that they can modify and hack things in the world, they find these incredible plasmids and gain the ability to use them and to get more powerful with them as the game progresses.
While not entirely the same, previous versions of Bioshock played upon this theme in completely different ways. According to the pitch document for the early version of Bioshock, the cultists within the underwater base somehow found a way to combine and mess with human DNA, not only crafting strange cyborgs, but also combining humans with many aquatic creatures to create strange hybrids that enhance their strength, speed, and agility. However, this splicing also led to their bodies undergoing great deformations, transforming them into absurd monstrosities. Their skin begins to peel and ooze, revealing the bone, as crab-like appendages sprout from different parts of their body, including their face, which has crab-like eyes bursting from their cheeks. Some individuals see their skin melt into a gelatinous blob, the remnants of their skin dangling from parts of their body. Other mutations includes a man with aquatic tendrils shooting out from all over their body. Another has become a SpongeBob character, now metamorphosizing into a giant fish. It's not just the enemies who can splice their DNA with different aquatic creatures, as the player was capable of doing this as well. Using bioengineering terminals found throughout the game, the player could merge their body with different sea animals or amphibians called genotypes, and take on the traits of those animals to give you an edge in battle. The crustacean genotype gave the player enhanced defense and allowed the player to use devastating swiping attacks. The jellyfish genotype let players poison enemies with a single touch and become invisible under the shadows. The eel genotype made the player electrical and let them use electrical attacks. And most dangerous of all, the fish genotype. I don't know, I guess it gives you the secrets to the Krabby Patty's secret formula. I doubt anyone would have ever used this anytime soon. Additional genotypes could be created through collecting a resource called genetic sequences, and once enough was amassed, they could purchase a new genotype at a genotype upgrade machine. These devices also allowed the player to upgrade their pre-existing genotype, allowing them to make them stronger and take on new attributes. Now you know why the game was called Bioshock. It was a convergence of technology and biological life, an experience that required players to deform and mess with their own bodies in horrific ways. It's your willingness to harm your very DNA in order to get the upper hand on your opponents. But these enemies could have been the ones you potentially fought in the original 2002 demo, based on descriptions by Eurogamer, who described the demo's enemies as science fiction B-movie monsters like a jellyman and an eelman.
We did a demo early on, probably 2003, that I wish we could find it. It was on Xbox One, and it was, you know, it was still underwater, but it looked a lot like a space station, and everything was really clean and Star Trek-y, and the monsters were of like the Scooby-Doo variety. It was all over the place as far as aesthetics.
The second iteration of Bioshock, set within a Nazi laboratory, also explored the idea of genetic experimentation, and you also begin to see a clear evolution in how the enemy designs are approached. The enemies in the second version of Bioshock aren't human, at least not anymore. Instead, they appear like parasites that have forcefully taken control of the human body. Unlike the genotypes from the first version, you can clearly tell that the humans here are no longer alive, instead being horrifically puppeteered by giant insect-like creatures with sharp mandibles. Insects like giant flies also seem to be one of the many creatures attempting to use a human as their host, creating a putrid sight we have the displeasure of witnessing. It's unknown where these creatures came from. Perhaps they were genetically modified organisms, or perhaps these entities have always been here, being freed into the world once we unearthed them by building this laboratory. One thing's for sure, they cannot be allowed to leave, and in order to combat them, we have to modify our bodies once again to become even more monstrous. Well, not quite. It seems the developers during this version of the game decided to ditch the concept of genotype manipulation. That's right, no longer could you mutate yourself and take on different traits of different aquatic animals. Instead, the genotype system had been replaced with something new called Plasmids. Plasmids are genetic material you inject into your body that grant you an array of abilities. But unlike the genotypes that essentially just mimic the biological capabilities of different sea creatures, Plasmids were more supernatural in nature, especially with abilities that give you immunities to specific environmental effects. In this version of Bioshock, the player is able to affect the temperature and air pressure of specific rooms. You can lower the temperature of a room until it's freezing cold. Not only does this make enemies who are weak to cold temperatures more vulnerable, but since you have a plasmid that allows you to resist the cold, you can move freely with little to no drawbacks. You can also raise the temperature of a location to exploit enemies with heat weaknesses, and even change the air pressure of a room so you can move quieter, extend the reach of a flame plasmid, and make your bullets more powerful by raising the pressure of a room. The idea of using your genetic powers in order to take advantage of environmental changes was also present in the cultist version of the game, and really shows that Irrational were keen on using the environment as a way to help the player fight enemies. As far as we are aware, the concept of the pressure changer remained in the game for quite a while, at least to the point where an icon was created for the machine and countless 3D models were made for it. Presumably this pressure machine was removed because it was a pretty confusing mechanic, and it was hard to demonstrate to players whether a level was low or high pressure. It's clear Irrational Games, at least by the time of the second version of Bioshock, had a pretty good idea on how they'd approach plasmids in the game, genetic material that when injected into your body would grant you strange biological powers. Plasmids were featured in the final experience and have become an almost intrinsic part of the game. However, unfortunately, many plasmids would be cut due to game balancing, such as the speed boost and teleportation plasmid that were present in the early versions of the game. It's unknown why Speed Booster was cut, but it probably has something to do with the more systematic and slow gunplay of Bioshock. Teleportation, which was also present in an early gameplay, was cut because it broke the game, causing certain mission events to break.
Look for the use of the teleportation plasmid, which will allow me to set up places in the world that I can teleport back to at any time.
Parasitic Healing was another plasmid that was cut in early development, and it allowed the player to drain an enemy of their health while healing you at the same time. The Spider Splicers would have been able to use this plasmid against you. The Aggressor Irritant plasmid is present in the gameplay demo as well, and caused all enemies in an area to attack whoever it was used against. In the final game, this plasmid was likely replaced by the Aggressor plasmid. Sanctuary was a plasmid that allowed the player to summon a bubble that would protect you from harm. However, it was later removed due to game balancing. Interestingly, plasmid bottles look completely different in the gameplay showcase, no longer appearing as bright and flashy as they are in the original game. Plasmid syringes also take on a different appearance, no longer large and bulbous, but small and skinny like a traditional syringe. Perhaps the design was changed so it could be more visually interesting. One cool detail is that these original syringes were present in the CG trailer for Bioshock, showing that at least during the creation of this trailer, they were still present in the game. Despite having plasmids figured out, they were still very much trying to decide how the game's enemies would look like.
The story evolved a lot over time. Like originally, once we had this notion of that there was a genetic engineering experimentation going on in the world, we started thinking, what would that do? We started thinking, what would that do to this culture? And originally, we had this notion that the city was run by a series of what we called savants.
We started out with this concept of savants that were like these genetically engineered characters that went so far they became sort of like brains in a jar kind of thing, and you were originally going to defeat a different savant on every level as you progress through the game, and it just, there were too many characters, they didn't make any sense, and it got really out of control, so we sort of pulled back from some of those ideas.
Plus interacting with a guy in a jar isn't...
Yeah, it was like, how are you going to have a boss fight with a guy in a jar? It was just a stupid idea, ultimately.
Another enemy that could have been used as a level boss was this one, which appears to be an amalgamation from different objects, creating a humanoid-like entity. The objects appear to be held together by yellow electricity, and wields a massive rivet gun and pipe. What exactly is this enemy? Well, it's not all that clear, but obviously it's not biological in any way, perhaps being a construct put together using different plasmids. As the development team continued to develop the enemy types for the game, they'd eventually land on the idea of the Aggressors, who are essentially close precursors to the Splicers at this stage in development. Aggressors were citizens of Rapture who purposely mutated themselves using Adam in order to increase their physical prowess and grant themselves the ability to use certain weapons to their full extent. One thing you'll notice about many Aggressors in the art is that you can see tubes of Adam pumping into their bodies, perhaps implying that they've mutated themselves so much that they need a constant supply of it to keep themselves alive or prevent immense amounts of withdrawal. Stitchy was one of the first aggressor enemy types added to the game, and he would serve as the shotgun-wielding enemy type you'd come across. His body is that of a large tumor. He's become so bloated that his intestines have begun to burst from his stomach, and his left arm is now missing due to his intense transformation. According to the developers, Stitchy actually made it into an early version of the game, even to the point of having finished animations and actual voiced dialogue. It was not until later in the development cycle that the team realized that the design was not working and ultimately cut him from the game. The Yam Hands enemy type were more melee oriented, judging from their lack of a weapon, instead charging at the player and attacking them with their large stumpy arms. In terms of overall design language, they look akin to Stitchy, showing that large brutish enemy types were a popular choice at this point in time. Finally, the Grenadier enemy type was a huge threat to the player, requiring us to either take cover or throw back their explosives using telekinesis. You can clearly tell that many of these early splicers take on a monstrous-like appearance. In fact, the developers had referred to them as Scooby-Doo monsters countless times. However, these designs for the aggressors did not work, as the developing team wanted the player to empathize with many enemy types in the game, so as a result, they would begin to lean towards more human-based looks they would begin referring to as splicers. You can clearly see the long evolution to get to the point we are now in terms of plasmids and splicers, and really demonstrates the painstaking and headache-fueled work the developers had to put in to get to this point. However, they can't rest just yet, because they still have a major set of characters to continue developing.
Look, Mr. Bubbles, it's an angel. I can see light coming from his belly.
As we progress throughout the game, we occasionally get a glimpse of two strange figures, a little girl and what appears to be a large man in a diving suit, and they seem to be this game's main selling point. They're in all the promotional material, the cinematic trailers, and even front and center on the cover art. These characters are called the Big Daddies and Little Sisters, and they are the sole reason for why this game ever got greenlit. So with that being said, let's talk about this game's unique ecosystem of gatherers, soldiers, and predators. So what is this ecosystem I'm referring to? Well, this ecosystem primarily involves three parties: the gatherers, who are responsible for collecting genetic material around the map; the soldiers, who are tasked with protecting the gatherers from harm; and the predators, whose job was to try and forcefully take the genetic material from the gatherers. This is the system Irrational refers to when they mention the term ecosystem, and based on the description of the feature alone, 2K Games gained interest in the project, leading to them funding the game. According to Ken Levine, they must have had faith in this unique game system, as it was unique enough to garner public interest, even despite the fact that it was not all that fleshed out at the time. Essentially, this idea of a system alone is why Bioshock was even funded to begin with, primarily inspired by the relationship between worker and soldier ants. This ecosystem is primarily referring to the Little Sisters, Big Daddies, and of course the Splicers. In regards to the former, you can often find big daddies and little sisters walking around an area, at least 3 per level. Your goal is to capture the little sister, but in order to do so, you must face off against the big daddies first, who serve as mini-bosses of the game. Big daddies are the protectors of the little sisters, and you often find them sticking close to them or wandering around the level. Make sure not to come too close to a little sister, as the big daddies will be sure to warn you with immediate aggression. During the early development of the game, players would often avoid fighting the big daddies due to how tough they were to fight, which makes sense as they charge at you with abnormal speed and they never allow you to take a break during combat. Besides the 2 big daddies you'll encounter in the game, there used to be one other version that was not included in the final version. This was the slow pro Big Daddy, who attacked the player with a giant hook and fired iron bearings at you with a shoulder-mounted cannon. The character was fully programmed and implemented into the game, but was removed to allow time to develop the other Big Daddy types. The slow pro would later be reused in Bioshock 2 as the rumbler Big Daddy, who could fire mini turrets throughout the map. To early test players, there really was no incentive to fight the Big Daddies, as they only dropped currency or items. The same items players could get much easier by fighting easier enemies. Due to this avoidance, Irrational Games decided to make one major change, locking an exclusive currency system behind defeating the Big Daddies. In the early version of Bioshock, especially the E3 demo, Adam appeared to be the only currency in the game, demonstrated by the player using Adam to shut down a security turret. In order to incentivize players to fight Big Daddies, Adam was turned into an exclusive currency used to buy more plasmids and upgrades. If the player wanted to get stronger, they had to catch a little sister, which meant they had to fight a Big Daddy as well. When you actually take a look at the early Big Daddy concepts, you realize that they don't actually look that different from the final version. Big Daddies were inspired by 19th century French diving suits in terms of their appearance, so many concepts of the Big Daddies followed this general design approach. The only major differences in the appearances of the Big Daddies include elements like their body types. While many concepts make the Big Daddies large and hulking creatures, some actually give them a pretty slim and average body type, helping them look a bit more human and normal. But perhaps the artist wanted Big Daddies to appear a lot more deformed, so these skinnier versions are few and far between in favor of more large, hulking versions. While the art does not really depict this element of the character all that extensively, they do showcase body deformation in many different ways through the use of parasitic slugs that latch themselves onto Big Daddies. Originally, certain Big Daddies would have slugs attached to their armor. These Big Daddies were called slug bugs, and the slugs would serve as a major hindrance to the player, either shooting fire or electricity at the player. The only way to take down the Big Daddy was to kill the slug embedded into their body, perhaps implying that the Big Daddy was being puppeteered by these parasitic slugs. These enemies were cut because they couldn't really find a way to make it work properly. One interesting fact is that plenty of other Big Daddy concepts featured them being taken over by parasitic tendrils once again, with their entire bodies sprouting them as if they were a virus. There were additional concepts for Big Daddies for the game, such as one that looks like some kind of dystopian beekeeper. Now that we've spoken extensively about the Big Daddies, it's about time we discuss the individuals they protect, the essential lifeblood of the city, and an element that will decide your morality in the game. Little sisters can be seen walking around the map, just like big daddies, often seen sticking close to them. Their job is to find Adam within dead bodies in Rapture, collect the Adam from their bodies using giant syringes, and then drink it to recycle that Adam using the sea slugs in their body so it can be sold once again. Since Adam has become such a valuable resource within Rapture, you see Splicers frequently try to attack them. Unfortunately, we are here too, and we'll get our hands on that Adam one way or another. Originally, the player could actually unalive the little sisters in the game, leading to some inconveniences as they would be caught in the crossfire during certain combat situations. In order to avoid massive outrage from the public, the developers made the little sisters invincible and added a morality system, allowing you to choose whether to harvest the sisters or save them, earning you more or less Adam based on which choice you make.
Then we start seeing that opportunity there of like, okay, nobody's going to want to do harm to these girls, or do they? Like, and do we allow them to? It was we weren't comfortable with it at first when it first came up that we could.
I think it was important that it was a way to reflect the sort of larger economic questions of a world like Rapture, where where the economy drives everything. Are there any limits to economic decision making versus moral decision making? Because that's sort of what the Randian notion is that it's not the role that you don't sort of legislate morality. Let's try to take that to an extreme and see where that ends up. And Little Sisters sort of became that. And in this world, they became a commodity. And the question we have for the players, are you willing, they're a commodity to you as well, potentially. Are you willing to participate in the commodification? There was, I think, a fair amount of nervousness internally at the publisher about it for a little while, but pretty quickly they were able to sort of say, look, we trust you guys, and go, do this. And I only had a few, the press, and this sort of happens over and over again, the games press worried a ton about it, and wring their hands about it. They ever recognized it was a setting topic, but that it was done to a larger purpose, that it wasn't just sort of like, hey, this is the game where you kill children.
This type of messed up morality was also present in an alternate way to collect Adam from Little Sisters. You see, originally, the player had to shoot Little Sisters with a special plasmid. This plasmid would cause them to start convulsing, attempting to reject the sea slugs within their bodies, leading to the big daddies turning aggro and attacking the player. The Gatherers, in the second version of Bioshock, were creatures that traveled throughout the map and gathered genetic material. We know this genetic material as Adam, and capturing these Gatherers was often one of the ways to get a massive amount of it. However, considering that this was the second version of the game, it's not clear if Adam was present at this time and it was just a completely different genetic material. Originally, the Gatherers were portrayed as disgusting-looking slugs that slid around the map and presumably gathered genetic material by feeding on corpses or maybe even drinking their blood. One alternate depiction had it look like a stingray that would almost soar through the map. Clearly, the developers were influenced by sea creatures when it came to the look of the Gatherers. This slug was featured in the game for quite a while, at least to the point where they were fully programmed into the game. When a player approached or attacked the slug, they would roll up into a defensive position and let out a clicking noise, which aggroed the big daddies to attack you. In the end, the slugs were cut from the game because 1, they were hard to notice, and 2, the developers wanted the players to feel empathy for the Gatherers, so they could question their morality about taking the genetic material. Slugs were far too ugly and gross to generate any kind of empathy from the player, so slugs were much too gross to generate any kind of empathy from the player. So as a result, the developers tried to look for substitutes that would connect much better, and there were frogs with tubes of Adam entering their butt crack. Maybe we'd feel bad for the amount of discomforts they'd feel, or maybe some of you would get off on that kind of thing, which, not judging, but you're weird. Why have I been talking about the frogs for so long? Okay, unfortunately, most people don't feel bad for frogs, so they wouldn't really be a good candidate to use. Other creatures used for the gatherers ranged from monkeys, a Disney Channel looking gerbil, a wheelchair dog who rode around the map and collected genetic material using its mouth. There were plenty of alien and large insect-looking gatherers as well, which only helped the player to be afraid of them rather than sympathize. And honestly, they seem a little out of place in the game. There were also gatherers who collected material using their crotch. Some of the final unique concepts for the gatherers were these ones, which appear to be Oompa Loompa looking creatures and have a full bodysuit as if they're collecting hazardous material. However, since they look so ugly, I doubt anyone would have spared them. It was not until later in development that the idea of making the gatherers little girls was cemented. At first, they appeared like zombie children or golem-like characters, perhaps showing that collecting Adam and consuming it on a regular basis had begun to disfigure their appearance. This disfigured look for the little sisters would be maintained for many concepts after, and some would even portray them as futuristic robots. However, it was not until the developers had the idea to base them off the twins from The Shining that the little sisters' looks were finally decided on. Bioshock is without a doubt one of the greatest FPSs of the 2000s, reaching the heights of Halo Combat Evolved and even Half-Life 2. While it's not perfect, the game will always remain a gem of what happens when a developer strives to innovate on a pre-established gameplay formula and don't back down on their vision despite all the elements working against them.
The original design was like way heavier into RPG type things as well. We had prerequisites on everything. You couldn't hack this unless you had that. You couldn't shoot this unless you found that. Like,
you really
there was all
couldn't do
kinds
anything.
of stuff.
Really. It was,
yeah, and
it was.
as we started getting these systems working, we were just like, gamers have to do way too much to get to the cool, fun stuff in this game. So we just started stripping all of that away, and it got more and more at its heart. The heart of the shooter kept bubbling more and more to the top.